The last dispatch from Coldwater Falls, November 8th, 2021. Coldwater Falls, Alaska. I pulled into Coldwater Falls in the pitch black of an Alaskan night, the landscape swallowed by darkness, save for a single, cracked street lamp that blinked half-heartedly at the end of the road. The town barely showed up on maps, so small and out of the way that it felt like it wanted to stay hidden. The drive had been long, and my body ached from hours of sitting, but the chill that crept up my spine as I stepped out of the car wasn't from the cold. It was something else. This place was quiet, unsettlingly so. I'd spent a lot of time in small towns, places where silence was comfortable, like a blanket of routine draped over people who had long settled into a slower life. But here, the silence was different. It felt unnatural, almost as though sound had been drained out of the place, leaving only a void. No dogs barking, no cars passing, not even the hum of distant conversation. Just a dead, still air that seemed to cling to my skin, like a warning. I checked onto a run-down inn on the edge of town, greeted by a hollow-eyed clerk who avoided my gaze. Her words were sparse, her sentences clipped. "Town's quiet this time of year," she muttered, as though that explained everything. I pressed her, asking if she knew anything about the disappearances I'd come to investigate. Her face paled, but she didn't answer. Instead, she handed me the room key and turned away, leaving me with nothing but a vague, unsettling feeling. In the dim room, I unpacked and sat down to go over my notes. The reports of missing persons had been scattered, popping up sporadically over the past few years, with no clear connection between the cases other than their last known location, somewhere around Coldwater Falls. There were whispers online about cold spots around town, strange patches of land where people claimed to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. I'd heard my share of ghost stories, but this was different. I could feel it, like a pulse in the walls around me. I had barely started the investigation, but Coldwater Falls already felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, something that had been watching long before I arrived. Like and subscribe for more videos. Tell me where you're from in the comments. I woke to a pale, anemic sunlight slipping through the thin curtains. Coldwater Falls in the daytime looked like a ghost of a town, as though it had been fading over years, with only a handful of people left to remember it. Buildings sagged under the weight of their own neglect. Paint peeled, windows stood smudged with dirt, and signs creaked on rusted chains. It was like the town had grown tired of itself, too weary to care about appearances. As I walked down the main street, I noticed that nobody was out. Doors were closed, blinds drawn, and even the shops that looked open seemed to be doing everything possible to keep their interiors hidden. There was no laughter or conversation, no daily hum of life I expected in any small town, no matter how remote. The silence here was thick and hollow, pressing down around me like a heavy coat I couldn't shrug off. Eventually, I found a tiny diner with its open sign flickering faintly, as if it might change its mind any second. Inside, the smell of old coffee and burnt toast hung in the air. A waitress stood behind the counter, staring blankly at nothing. I ordered coffee, trying to strike up a conversation, but she answered in clipped, monosyllabic responses. I couldn't tell if it was distrust, fear, or something else entirely. The only time her expression changed was when I mentioned the disappearances. Her hand froze mid-pour, coffee dripping onto the counter. Without a word, she turned and disappeared into the kitchen. I sipped the lukewarm coffee, glancing around the empty diner. The silence outside seemed to seep inside, too, settling into every crevice, filling the spaces between words, thickening the air. The longer I sat there, the more it felt like I was sinking, like the silence itself was a living thing, pressing down, seeping into my thoughts, filling my lungs. Just as I was about to leave, an older man shuffled in, looking just as faded as everything else in Coldwater Falls. He took a seat across from me without invitation, his eyes sharp but tired. "You're here about the cold spots, aren't you?" he asked in a voice so soft I almost didn't hear it. "I'd stay away from those places if I were you," he said, his tone matter of fact. "Things get strange when you start looking too closely." Then he fell silent, his gaze distant, as if he was already somewhere else. The old man's name was Tom Holloway, and he had the kind of look that told stories even before he spoke. A face carved by years, eyes holding shadows of things they'd seen and tried to forget. He sipped his coffee slowly, his hands shaking just enough to spill a drop or two on the worn tabletop. He didn't seem to notice. When he looked up at me, there was a flicker of something in his gaze, a hesitation, as if he was already regretting sitting down with me. "People don't come to Coldwater Falls unless they're lost, or looking to get lost," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Which one are you?" "Neither, hopefully," I replied. "I'm here because of the stories, the disappearances. I think something's been going on here, something people are afraid to talk about." He leaned back, his expression shifting, almost like he was relieved. "Afraid? No, not afraid. We just learned to live with it." He pulled something from his coat pocket, a small frayed journal, edges worn, cover faded. He pushed it toward me, nodding once for me to take it. "This belonged to my son." I took the journal carefully, feeling the weight of it. It wasn't heavy, but there was something unsettling about it, as if the little book held secrets that didn't want to be shared. Tom's eyes fixed on it, distant but intense, like he was seeing things I couldn't. "He was one of the first to vanish," he murmured. "He was obsessed with finding the cold spots around here." I glanced at the journal in my hands, curiosity warring with caution. "Cold spots?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "They're scattered all over the town," he said, nodding slowly. "Patches of ground where the temperature drops. More than the Alaskan cold. You feel it in your bones, like something's crawled under your skin." He went out to map them, kept a record of every spot he found. Tom's voice wavered, his eyes glossy. After a while, he stopped coming home. I opened the journal to the first page, seeing a crude map of the town with small X's marked over certain areas. Beside each mark, he'd written notes, short, disjointed observations. "Heavy air, can't breathe, felt watched." Each line grew more frantic, more desperate, the handwriting darker, pressing harder into the paper. The last entry was almost unreadable, the ink smeared like it had been written with a trembling hand. "He found something," Tom said, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. "Something he shouldn't have. And now, he's a part of it." That night I sat in my room at the inn, the journal open on the table, its frayed pages illuminated by the weak glow of a single lamp. I had thought about waiting, maybe easing into what this little book held, but I couldn't shake the sense of urgency, as if whatever was within those pages was pulling me in, a magnetic force both sinister and compelling. The first entries were simple notes, like a catalog of places around Coldwater Falls, where Tom's son, Daniel, had sensed something unusual. Each location was marked with an X, with a date and a single-line description. The abandoned church on the hill, bone-deep cold. The stretch of forest by the river, air too thick. An alley behind the general store. like drowning. Short phrases, nothing more, but they painted a picture that I couldn't quite grasp. The words weren't trying to frighten. They simply documented a grim reality as he'd felt it. As I flipped the pages, Daniel's handwriting grew increasingly erratic, as if something within him was unraveling. The notes became longer, spilling over the lines, as though he couldn't write fast enough to capture what he was experiencing. The cold isn't just a feeling, he'd written. It's alive, a weight that sinks into your lungs, pressing until you can't breathe. My eyes lingered on that sentence. I read it again and again, feeling that same weight in my own chest. In one entry, Daniel described an incident by the river. He had been standing at one of his mapped cold spots, notebook in hand, when he suddenly couldn't move. He described a strange sensation, a tingling that began at his fingertips and spread through his body, locking him in place. It was like my own limbs didn't belong to me, he wrote. Couldn't turn my head, couldn't speak, just stood there, waiting for something. The last few pages were almost illegible. Daniel had written frantically, the lines crooked and smeared, like he'd been scribbling while on the run. "It knows I'm looking for it," he'd scrawled. "It's aware. Every time I find a new spot, the cold gets worse, like it's recognizing me, learning me." The final entry was a single sentence, scrawled in letters so dark they'd torn through the paper. "Don't let it know you're there." The air had turned brittle by the time I reached the edge of town, where one of Daniel's marked cold spots lay. The abandoned lumber mill loomed in the dark, its rusted shells stark against the starless sky, and the ground around it seemed unnaturally still. I felt the cold before I'd even reached the spot itself, a creeping chill that started at my fingers and crawled up my spine, settling deep in my bones. I took a few tentative steps, heart hammering, as I moved into the spot Daniel had marked with an X. It was subtle at first, just a slight drop in temperature, but then it plunged. The air thickened, heavy and sour, like something decaying beneath the surface, and the cold became almost unbearable. I glanced around, the silence so dense it felt as though sound had been vacuumed out of the space. And then, something strange happened. The world around me blurred, like the edges of reality were bending. My legs felt suddenly heavy, and a numbness spread through my body, pinning me in place. I tried to move, but it was like my own limbs refused to respond. Panic flared as I realized I couldn't even lift a finger, my body trapped in that terrible cold. I took a shuddering breath and felt an odd pressing awareness around me, as though the cold itself had weight, a consciousness that was probing, recognizing, almost learning me, just as Daniel had written. The sensation was intrusive, burrowing beneath my skin, curling inside my chest. My breath came in shallow gasps, clouding the air in front of me, the mist lingering as though it, too, was frozen in place. My thoughts became muddled, slipping away as if they were drifting out into that oppressive chill. I tried to remember why I had come, why I was standing here alone in the dark, but even those memories felt distant, dimming with each second. It was like I was sinking, being pulled down into a quiet, frozen oblivion. Then with a sudden painful jolt, the cold let go. I stumbled backward, my limbs trembling as feeling returned, pins and needles stabbing every muscle. The air warmed just slightly, but the sensation of being watched hadn't faded. I looked around, half expecting to see someone or something there, but I was alone. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me, and when I pulled it out, I saw the time. I'd been standing in that spot for nearly 2 hours, though it had felt like only minutes. My heart pounded as I realized it wasn't just the cold that had held me. It was something else entirely, something that was still out there, watching, waiting. Back at the inn, I collapsed onto the bed, still rattled from the night at the lumber mill. My limbs ached, as if the cold had left bruises beneath my skin, and there was a strange buzzing in my head, a feeling I couldn't shake. Everything about the last few hours felt fractured, like shards of a broken mirror, sharp, confusing fragments that refused to settle. I pulled out my phone to review the voice notes I'd taken earlier that day, hoping they'd give me a clearer sense of what had happened. But as I pressed play, I realized something was wrong. The audio was a garbled mess, static filling most of the recording. Beneath the hiss, there were faint sounds, the rush of wind, the scrape of my footsteps, but something else, too. A voice, soft and distorted, layered beneath it all, speaking in a tone I didn't recognize. I pressed the phone closer, my heart pounding. It was my own voice. I heard myself mumbling, but the words didn't make sense, scattered phrases slipping into one another. She's there. Cold. Feels wrong. Then clearer. Elsa. Elsa is still in the forest. The name hit me like a punch. I didn't know anyone named Elsa. I rewound the recording, but the sound was the same every time. It was as if some part of me had spoken without my knowing. Recorded words I didn't remember saying. I scrolled back through the recordings, searching for anything else unusual, and found another one from earlier in the night, right after I'd arrived at the lumber mill. But this one was stranger. It wasn't my voice at all. It was faint, barely above a whisper, yet unmistakably human, speaking in a breathy, broken cadence. Coldwater keeps, Elsa keeps. The words trailed off, replaced by a long, empty silence. Then the recording ended. I shut off the phone, my pulse pounding. My memory felt hazy, as if parts of it had been wiped clean, and I couldn't piece together what had actually happened by the mill. There were flashes of images that slipped through my mind. Trees bending in the wind, a patch of frozen ground, a face I couldn't quite remember. And then, the strangest realization hit me. Somewhere deep inside, I could feel her. Elsa, or at least the thought of her, pressing against my mind like a bruise that ached to be remembered. It was as if she had left a mark, a ghostly reminder that wouldn't fade, her presence now tied to mine, lingering in the back of my mind like a whisper I couldn't silence. The next day, I found Tom sitting alone on a bench near the edge of town, his figure hunched against the morning chill, looking more like a ghost than a man. He didn't seem surprised when I approached, as if he'd been expecting me. Without a word, he gestured for me to sit. His eyes were distant, fixed on the thick forest that bordered the town, the same forest where I'd felt Elsa's presence clawing into my mind. I listened to the recordings. I said, my voice coming out hoarse. There was a name. Elsa. Who was she? Tom's jaw clenched, and for a moment, he looked older than I'd ever seen him, worn down by secrets he'd been carrying for far too long. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered photograph. It was creased and faded, but I could still make out the image of a young woman, her face solemn, and her gaze piercing even in black and white. She seemed to look through me, her eyes holding secrets that felt too heavy for someone her age. "That's Elsa," Tom said, voice barely above a whisper. "She was the first to disappear, back in '62. "Disappear," I echoed, feeling the weight of the word sink in. Tom nodded, his gaze still fixed on the trees. "They said she just left one day, that she must have run off, but folks around here knew better. Elsa had no reason to leave, no place to go. But then, strange things started happening. The cold spots. They began showing up right after she vanished, and soon after, people started feeling it, the pull of something they couldn't explain. People felt watched, drawn to certain places, just like you have been. The pieces were starting to come together, fragments of an invisible puzzle that seemed to stretch back decades. "And the cold spots?" I asked, dreading the answer. "People say Elsa never left Coldwater Falls. Not completely. She's a part of this town now, bound to it somehow. Those cold spots, they're where she reaches through, like she's still trying to find her way back." He paused, his hands trembling. "Or maybe she's looking for something. Someone." I stared at the photograph, feeling the hollow eyes of the girl burn into mine. It felt as if she were there, standing somewhere just out of sight, watching. "What does she want?" I whispered. Tom's voice dropped, each word heavy. "Maybe she wants what all ghosts want. Recognition, revenge, or maybe just company." His gaze shifted to me, haunted. "The question is, will you be the one to give it to her?" The air grew colder as I approached the forest where Elsa had last been seen, clutching her faded photograph like a talisman. The trees rose around me, their branches twisted and skeletal, a canopy of shadows that seemed to press down, closing me in. I could feel the weight of the silence here, denser than anywhere else in Coldwater Falls, as if the forest held its breath, waiting for something or someone. I took out my phone and hit record, speaking softly into the silence. November 10th, 2021. I'm at the edge of Coldwater Falls, where the last trace of Elsa Holloway was found in 1962. It feels like she's here. My voice sounded foreign, barely a whisper against the vast, cold quiet. The deeper I walked, the more the temperature dropped, every breath becoming a thin white cloud that hung in the air longer than it should. The cold settled into my bones, the kind that had nothing to do with the weather. I reached a small clearing, a patch of frozen ground covered in a thin layer of frost, just like the spots Daniel had marked. The air felt thick, like stepping into water. I tried to move, but an invisible force seemed to hold me in place, rooting me to the spot. My phone slipped from my fingers and fell to the ground, the screen still recording as I stood frozen. And then I felt it. A presence, subtle but unmistakable, something circling around me. It wasn't visible, yet I could feel it pressing against me, probing, like fingers tracing the contours of my thoughts. My mind felt crowded, overwhelmed, as though someone else was in there, searching through my memories, through everything I was. Images flickered across my mind, memories that weren't mine. Dark woods, laughter echoing, Elsa's face, her eyes wide with a longing that felt ancient and endless. I felt a strange pull, as if she was drawing me into her own story, dragging me across time into her world. The cold seeped deeper, an anchor pulling me under, her loneliness filling me, a void so vast it threatened to consume me whole. My last thought, before the numbness took over, was of Tom's words echoing in my mind. Maybe she's looking for company. The camera's red light blinked one last time as the battery died, leaving only the frost-covered clearing and the silence of the forest. Elsa had found what she was looking for, and now, so had I. Like and subscribe for more videos. Tell me where you're from in the comments.